Approximately 6 years ago, if my math serves me right, I remember I was tasked with a very important duty. And my job was to engage in a process of digital transformation where, quite simply, or at least when I look at it now, I say quite simply, all I had to do across the enterprise, approximately 100 accounts, I had to shift us from a legacy telephony system to an online, cloud based desktop client system. And while I had my vendor in place, I had my technology in place, one of the toughest things, or shall I say, the challenge that I ran into was the behavior, was how do I get my staff to suddenly shift away from the traditional process of picking up a phone to now using their desktop and a desktop client to engage in communications and customer service. It was at this time that my then CEO said something very interesting to me that I believe shapes today's conversation quite well. He said, Ali, we shape our systems, and in turn, our systems shape us. When he was trying to tell me that the importance here is if you can put in place a solid system, eventually it will drive user behavior. And if you've kept the UX in mind, the users will adapt and adopt. And I think that model speaks very closely to the conversation that I'm going to have today with a good friend and a wonderful guest from Cloudflare on the topic of zero trust network access and data loss prevention strategies. My name is Ali Hirji, and I'm the host of the Power Hour. And this Power Hour, brought to you by Cloudflare, is a continuation of the celebration of International Women's Day. International Women's Day this year was all about breaking the bias. And I hope through this discussion, we can also break the bias around different ideas, the bias around skill, the bias around talent, and also some of our bias that we might have around legacy technology. This Power Hour is also 22 days away from Canadian Women in Cybersecurity 2022, proudly sponsored and supported by Cloudflare. And I'm looking forward to today, not just looking at the technology behind Zero Trust Network, but the policies behind it, the processes behind it, and also the people behind it. Because that's what the Power Hour is all about. It's about people, process, and technology. My guest today has a very interesting background when it comes to cybersecurity, and she began in the world of physics and as a teacher. Now, you know what they say about physics? Physics is not complicated. Physicists, well, we'll find out. But I'm sure today she's going to break through some of those complications and show us about her journey, breaking a lot of bias, and more importantly, getting her customers to take on new technologies in a confident and supported environment. As I said before, my name is Ali, and I'm joining you live from the beautiful city of Oshawa. And for those of you that are watching online, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Before I go ahead to introduce our guest, it is important for me to also recognize that as we're watching this session online, the online space also constitutes Indigenous space. Our network cables, our aerial networks all run across this land, these skies, and these seas. And it's important that we take the time to recognize the Indigenous territories and lands that we live on. We're thankful to our Indigenous ancestors for making all of these knowledge exchanges possible. My guest, and I'll take a flight from Oshawa all the way to Portland, Oregon, joins us from the United States, a recent recruit into Cloudflare, but someone who is definitely going to be making a lot of waves in the space of zero trust and digital or data loss prevention strategies. I've only met her once, but I can tell you she has quite a bit to say. And we're going to start off with her journey as a teacher and then dive further. Without further ado, everybody, please join me in welcoming Noelle Gotthardt. Noelle, welcome to the Power Hour.
Thank you so much for having me. That was a wonderful intro. I really appreciate it. I joined Cloudflare pretty recently, but I've loved the team so far, getting to dive into zero trust, getting to dive into data loss prevention. My background in insider threat made me really passionate about it, and I'm really excited to talk about it today.
I think the subject of insider threat, the typical standard of know what you do not know, is something that we will also dive into. And for our audience, as I take the first 10 minutes sort of exploring Noelle's journey as a woman in cybersecurity, I'd also remind all of you on cyberexchange.ca that you can go to the groups and you can download some very interesting information that's been dropped there around Zero Trust Network Access. There's also a paper there which does comparisons between VPNs and Zero Trust networks. And I highly recommend that you have that as a reference point, because at about 15 minutes in, we'll start diving into those subjects. And I think you might have quite a few questions. Drop your questions in the chat and I'll be sure to bring them up as we go along. Noelle, let's take the first 10 minutes to learn a little bit about your journey as a woman in cybersecurity. One of the things that you mentioned to me was that as a teacher, especially in physics, you looked at problems in a very interesting way. You didn't see a challenge as a problem. You saw every problem as a challenge, as an opportunity. Can you tell us a little bit about how teaching, and that too teaching in physics, got you interested and well equipped for a career in cybersecurity?
That's a great question. I think a lot of elements actually overlapped. When I first started teaching, I came at it with the approach of how do I be the best teacher? How do I, like say everything in the exact right way and do it in the exact right way to make students be able to understand physics. And I sort of quickly learned that that wasn't the best approach. The best approach was that everyone learns a little bit differently, and I need to find a way to make them less intimidated by the material and eager to learn and eager to find a way to identify with the information. And so I started to perceive my challenge not as delivering something perfectly, but making others feel comfortable asking questions and not feeling intimidated by difficult material. So many students would come into the classroom feeling so intimidated before they even knew what physics really was. It just has a reputation of being difficult. So how do I make that relatable? So my challenge was not to solve the problem for them, but to make them comfortable solving the problem and equipping them with that. And so that really translated to cybersecurity for me, because I think it can be a place where communication is so important, and trying to make sure that everyone understands everything about it, from leadership down to the analysts to the product managers, whoever it might be, they need to be able to thoroughly understand the problem, be comfortable asking the questions to make sure that everything is meeting everyone's needs. So I now sort of approach it from that perspective of how do I make sure the communication is good? How do I make sure the right questions are being asked? So I really sort of enjoyed that piece of it. And I still to this day take the main thread of that as how do I make sure that everyone is comfortable and not intimidated to ask those questions?
I can relate to, because sometimes as an academic and as a teacher, we often find ourselves in that position where we have to be a little comfortable with being uncomfortable in order to let our students explore new concepts. But Noelle, and just because we're taking the first few minutes to set the tone about your journey, I think it's important that you mention the word communication. And one of the biggest problems with communication is the assumption that it's happened. How did you make sure that the message was getting across? Because in cybersecurity, you can beat your chest all you want about requiring more budget, requiring more skill, but how do you know that the finance team on the other side, or in this case, the students on the other side, are actually getting the message? How did you enhance your communication skills?
That's a wonderful question. I love that question. I sort of think of it as when you're starting to learn a language, like your first step in learning a language is being able to understand what's being said to you, but you can't fully turn around and reply in that same language. So you can process it, but you might not be able to speak it. And so my goal was always to get the other person to be able to speak it back to me, because that's when I felt like it really started to sink in. And so if I can get the other person to kind of walk me through, like, okay, how are you feeling about this? How do you understand this? Or where are you at with it? Then I started to see the holes, the gaps in the communication, where things were misunderstood. And again, I think that goes back to my previous point of making them feel comfortable enough to have that conversation and to put themselves out there and start trying to describe what they think. Because I think it's very easy, whether it be physics or in cybersecurity, to get off a call or be on a call and say, like, yes, I understand, but have gaps and not want to maybe vocalize them because you're not sure, you're intimidated. So how can I open those doors, have them say the information back to me and feel like I'm not questioning them, I'm not judging them, I'm just making sure that I'm doing my job thoroughly.
Yeah, never fail to try. Noelle, I'm going to extend that conversation just a little bit more, this aspect of never fail to try. One of the things that you mentioned in your notes to me, and I have to say, I've been doing this Power Hour for the last 2 years now, and it was really, truly fascinating to get such a detailed, in-depth, retrospective analysis of your journey. So thank you for that, because you did 90% of my job. Noelle, I want to dive into this just a little bit more. You know, this aspect of don't fail to try. There are certain situations as a teacher in the world of physics, and then also in cybersecurity, where you may not always have the right answer, and you may not always have the right solution. You might be in the middle of a breach. You may not know which is that system, or which was ground zero, where the infection began from. How did you build a support system around your teaching? How did you feel that courage that if you got stuck somewhere, you could work with your colleagues? Did you have to do anything specific there?
I at this point I'm starting to feel like you already know what I'm going to say, or you seem to have some intuition about my background a little bit, which is amazing. I really feel like my success came from building relationships, and I don't think I would have gotten nearly as far as I have in my career without building those relationships. And so, like one of the many things that I've fallen back on is that communication and being able to ask for help, um, and 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 having the people around me that I feel like will support me and get me there, even if I don't know the answer. And being willing to put myself out there like that and say, look, I don't know this. You know, it was intimidating as a young teacher to say to a student when they asked a physics question, like, I don't know. You know, like, let me get back to you. Let me look into it. So I would start first, you know, like, can I look online? And then eventually I realized, why don't I just talk to my fellow teachers, talk to other physics teachers, say, like, how do you find out answers for this? How do you deal with this? And I had great mentorship. And I took that to cybersecurity. I started to ask, you know, the people that I work with, their experiences. How do you deal with these things? So really, like, I think that I have so much and so many people to thank for just being able to sit here and answer your questions right now.
Noelle, I agree with you. You know, you should know what you do not know. And I know that we had determined that we'd look at questions a little later on, but guess what? A question did come in, and I think it's a very good opportunity, since we want to spend a few more minutes about your journey. And a good astute comment that has come in is, you know, you're a teacher. Have you ever considered a career as a cyber instructor as opposed to a product manager? Noelle on the hot seat.
I think honestly, absolutely. I totally would. I think that teaching was an amazing experience, and I loved it. And I think I sort of had the benefit with physics of the fact that I had to know more physics than the kids who were walking into this room, because they had no exposure, and I had a bachelor's degree in it. I think just like anyone else in this world, you know, I suffer from a little bit of imposter syndrome and a little bit of worry of not being able to understand everything, not knowing everything, being newer in this field. So I'd admit that my hesitation would be much more along the lines of, am I ready? Can I do this? You know, like, can I provide this help? And can I be the instructor that people need? And maybe that's just some normal self-doubt. You know, maybe I'm being hard on myself, but I think I absolutely would, and would probably enjoy it at some point in my career.
I think that's why the hashtag of the Canadian Women in Cybersecurity Conference, hashtag #VRCyber, really resonates with me, and clearly resonates with you as well. And I'll repeat this, and I've said this on many sessions, that what you're hearing from Noelle is that in cybersecurity, yes, you do need those pen testers. Yes, you do need that individual that can work with different versions of Linux and do different open source tools and write their own. But you also need creative thinkers. You also need people with a physics background. You need people to really think about every scenario and every situation. People, process, and technology is so central to that. Noelle, thank you for that. I do want to ask you one more question about your journey as we then talk about how you broke into public sector and then now as a leader, as a product manager within Cloudflare. Noelle, straight up question, no holds bar, is as a woman getting into now cybersecurity, was there one particular challenge that you can point to that you had to address head on?
That's a fascinating question. Um, Address head on. I think I definitely along the way have sort of encountered a situation where I was younger and I was new, and I I like to take information in, and I like to think things through before formulating answers sometimes. And I definitely encountered a number of engineers, of, like strong-headed personalities that were sort of willing to bulldoze the conversation a little bit, because I was being a little bit pensive and a little bit, thoughtful before I started to speak up. And I would, it was harder for me to get my ideas sort of in the room. And so I sort of approached it twofold, as I had conversations with those people who were sort of louder, and, started to talk through, how can we improve this communication? How can we find a better way to find balance? And I think I also challenged myself to speak up a little bit more and to be more outspoken, and see if I can sort of break through that desire to sit and think a little bit before I formulate, because eventually, you have to speak up in the room. And so I don't think I have it figured out. I still feel like I'm learning my career and learning how to navigate every single day. But it was a tougher one for me to learn, that I'm still working on, but I think I've made great improvements on.
A wise saint once said, to teach is to learn. And clearly, the teacher in you is always learning. And that's an important takeaway from this introduction to you. I think what's also crucial as we now start to look at your journey into Cloudflare is that, difficult situations can break people, but in some cases, difficult situations can get people to break records, or to break the system in a certain way. And I think you went down this path. So after your life in teaching, you were in San Francisco. You had a stint in the FBI doing some work in threat intelligence. At a cursory level, just a high level, can you tell our audience a little bit about what you learned from that experience working at the FBI? What did it teach you about your own process in cyber? Any lessons learned from there that you can provide us at a high level?
Yeah, so many, so many. I guess sort of the one question, and the question I get most often before we sort of jump into what I learned, was, how did I go from a teacher to an FBI agent?
Yep.
And to be very straightforward, like, I did what everyone does, and I applied online, and I went through their application process. So there's no special connection there or anything. It was just, like, apply online, hope for the best. I worked as you mentioned, I worked in San Francisco on cyber threats and cyber investigations. And I loved it. Honestly, it was amazing. It was, my sort of journey took me into a more financially motivated situation, but it was an amazing journey. And I learned so many things, just because at that time I had learned physics. I hadn't learned cybersecurity.
Yeah.
So I all of a sudden was in a situation where it was, okay, show up to these companies who had just been breached and start interviewing and taking in information for cyber breaches almost day one when I got to the office. And I had to learn cybersecurity from drinking through a fire hose constantly. And again, I think the things that I learned there were how to take a step back a little bit and realize the information that I need immediately, and start to at least, get into that idea of, like, don't panic. Like, I know the people in the room are panicking, but don't panic, and take in the information you need and think through it, and don't rush, and rely on the resources you have. Like, it wasn't going to be the end of the world if I had to call another agent and say, like, is there anything that you would recommend asking before I leave here? Is there any help or any advice you can provide? So I think it helped me learn that, sort of going back earlier, like, use your resources, start to think things through, don't panic, be thoughtful in the way you approach things. So I think that was sort of some of the bigger stuff that I learned, kind of on a more 10,000-foot scale.
Thank you for that. There's a question that came in, and I'll reword it a little bit. So, Raj, good question. Raj asked the question about what is it like being in intelligence as a woman. But Noelle, I want to rephrase that a little bit. And Raj, I'm sure you'll allow me to do this. Noelle, besides being a woman in intelligence, your background in physics ultimately gave you a background in a subject where many people tend to be allergic, which is math. So you were driven with quantitative analysis quite a bit. Did that quantitative analysis and that will to always show mathematical proof that something has happened, did that also shape your intelligence practices, how you looked at data? Did that have any influence in your work?
I think so. That's another great question. I'll be completely honest, I'm very intimidated by math. Like, I think it's one of the more difficult things for me. It's not something that ever came very naturally. But I loved the challenge, and I loved the fact that it was difficult for me. And I loved that the satisfaction of sort of solving a problem at the end is wonderful. And so I think that piece, like that learning to step through things methodically and try and get to an answer at the end of an investigation is so rewarding. So for me, it was sort of, rather than sort of specifically being on the mathematical side, on the physics side of how do I start, where do I start, how do I organize the information, what steps do I take, and that methodical thought process of problem solving is kind of what drove me into the cybersecurity realm, into the investigations realm. I think that was a really cool sort of chain to challenge myself.
And I think when you do that, since I have a little bit of a background in data, for the audience that knows me, I do teach in AI and security, so I should know a little bit about data, or at least that's what they hire me for. But one of the things that you realize very quickly, and Noelle, I think you may have also realized this as well, is as you start peeling away at the network data, you start looking at intelligence data, you get answers, but the answers only drive you to more questions. There never really is a moment where you can put a full stop on something. The data always derives more and more insight. And I think, Noelle, it'll be very fascinating perhaps one day to even have a discussion about, your vision about how some of this data will fuel AI technologies, Web3 that folks are talking about as well. But I'll park that aside and now go from that journey in the FBI to now you're starting a career at Cloudflare. And you're looking at Cloudflare. I'm a huge Cloudflare fan. I use it in most of my productions, nearly 65 companies that I'm currently working in applied research with. All have been recommended to utilize Cloudflare from at least a perspective of protecting against DDoS. If Jillian's watching, hint, hint, I love the shirt Noelle has. I'd take a shirt. I do have a Cloudflare water bottle, but I am fasting, so I cannot drink water today. But I will at the end, and I'll drink it in my Cloudflare bottle and post a picture on Cyber Exchange. I kid, let's continue. Noelle, you begin this journey into Cloudflare. Now, we all know Cloudflare, 121 terabytes per second network, blocking nearly 70 billion malicious attacks in a day. What interested you in joining Cloudflare? And I'll put it blankly. What was it?
It honestly really was the people. Like I started talking to them and I was like just impressed. I had heard their name when I was with the FBI and worked with them just ever so slightly more, like just hearing through the community sort of what the great work they were doing. And then sort of as I started to get involved in insider threat and data loss prevention, and they were looking to create this product line within Zero Trust, I started talking to the team and I was so impressed by the intelligence of the team. They were all incredibly capable, incredibly smart, but also incredibly passionate about what they do. They clearly loved building, they loved adding and helping and the technology. But then what really drove it home for me was throughout the entire interview process, and still to this day within my team, the concept that's pushed is empathy. And how do we empathize with customers? And you don't solve a problem by saying this is the answer. You solve a problem by listening to the customer and hearing what the problem is and finding a way to help them. And that very much sort of resonated if we go back to that beginning of the conversation, right? Like telling a student, like, this is what you do. That's not always the best answer, but it's listening to that student and their struggles and finding a way to help them. And so as they started to tell me that story, I was fascinated by it and really engaged by it, because that's, to me, like if I were to talk about whether I was a teacher or whether I was an FBI agent or whether I was a product manager, like my happiness comes from helping others and feeling like I got to help someone out. And so when they started saying that, and I realized that I could sort of use this cybersecurity knowledge to help give someone an answer and help, provide them with a solution and help them solve a problem, that to me was really fascinating, and ultimately kind of was the decision to join.
Yeah, I've said this many times that there was once upon a time security was, a convenient thing to have. Now it's a necessity. And it's really important that when you use the word empathy and zero trust, is that you really need to listen to what your clients are telling you, because when it comes to deploying models such as zero trust, ultimately it comes down to whether you have the resources in-house, and more importantly, whether you even have the budget to do it. And if someone's listening, they kind of can tell what solution and what needs to be architected for you in order for you to at least adopt some element of zero trust modeling. Now, we're going to go dive deeper into this whole world, which you've been talking about, DLP, data loss prevention. You've referenced zero trust. I want to first understand a little bit about, you've mentioned that you've now heading up this team that is now launching a series of products around data loss prevention and zero trust. Can you tell us about the process of setting up your team? Who's on your team? What does the team look like in Cloudflare to support clients when it comes to zero trust models? And I see questions already coming in about zero trust. We'll get to that. Drumil, thank you for your question. We'll come to that shortly. Noelle, tell us a little bit about your team that supports this development.
Yeah, so I'm the product manager sort of specifically for data loss prevention and working with an engineering team, which will be launching the data loss prevention portion of the product coming soon. And then sort of the team that I work with is other product managers working through other pieces of sort of the zero trust story. We have someone, focused on access and access management and helping on the identity side. We have someone working on our secure web gateway. Someone on the browser isolation team and working with our browser isolation technology. Then the whole thing is on-ramped by a client working through like, how do we get this traffic up through to Cloudflare's network? And then we're also, right, like I feel like I'm talking so much about our products now, but we have an awesome tunnel product and we have a PM there. And then sort of we just started moving into the CASB space. So we have sort of a whole slew of products that we're sort of working through. And I think the most important thing that we're thinking of right now is how do we make these products work together and how do we make them give a real solution? Because if we all just work sort of piecemeal, like, data loss prevention does this and, access does this and they don't work together, that's frustrating for the customer and it doesn't really provide them a great solution. How do we give them an offering that makes it work well and makes their problems easier to solve?
Interesting points. And I agree, you've spoken about the products, but the people are there behind the products, and we'll dissect that as we go a little bit forward. Noelle, a question for you. Now, I've seen this criticism come up quite a bit at other conferences. I know at Canadian Women in Cybersecurity, for example, one of the topics is around building trust with zero trust. But one criticism that you see quite a bit is ZTNA or zero trust is sort of like a buzzword. For our audience, because we have a myriad of folks here, we have folks who are small businesses, we have folks at the enterprise level, and there are some questions which are more technical, which we'll try and get to as well. But for our audience, if you had to explain what is a zero trust model, what would be your best foot forward there?
It's a great question. And I think you'll probably get slightly different answers depending on, right, the experiences and the approaches. And so I sort of understand any sort of criticism or questioning about, like, what does this really mean and what does this really give us? And so I'll give Cloudflare's understanding and sort of approach to this concept of zero trust and really where it comes from and why we prioritize it. And so what we on a one sentence level, like what we really think of zero trust is that every request and every connection should have to prove who they are, so that there is identity verification as requests and connections come in. But where this really comes from is the struggle that Cloudflare itself had, and that we've seen a lot of our customers have, is like the old concept of a network really came from back when everyone would physically go into an office and there was a network there and you physically plug in, and in order to access it, you originally had to get through layers of physical security, and your applications were hosted, on site. And the concept is very a specific building, or we'll say a castle in a moat, where, your moat is your firewall. And if you had to connect remotely to this situation, you'd use a VPN, which by default would, allow you access remotely to this network. But ultimately, like the problem that Cloudflare ourselves had, and we started to see customers have, is that if you need to create this remote connection, you poke this hole in the network to access it remotely, and that would just by default give you access to the rest of the entire network, which might have been something that you were a little bit more willing to risk when you already had to get through all the physical security boundaries. But when you're poking this hole remotely and you can get to it over the internet, that's much more scary. And then there's also the piece of it that you then would have to backhaul all your traffic through this VPN device, and performance became an issue. And we started moving towards SaaS, so that performance became even more of a question. So I think ultimately it was the zero trust concept came for us about the fact that we were seeing problems, right? Like we go back earlier to how does Cloudflare approach things, is that we were seeing that there was security questions, and our own security team was not happy with this model, and we were seeing performance frustrations, and our own employees were frustrated. So I think it really wasn't that like, how do we build the solution right away? It was that we have these problems, and how do we start to fix them, and how do we start to create something that, if the solution isn't working, let's think of a new way to think about it. So that sort of pushed us towards, building a zero trust solution.
Interesting. And I think, one of the things that when I've been lecturing on this subject is you need to look at zero trust almost like a framework, and solutions developed within that framework. At the end of the day, you do have to deploy some applications. You do have to engage in some technical speak, for lack of a better word, but it is definitely a solution that replaces and looks at the traditional VPN differently. To our audience, I know that there are a few folks that have joined who may not necessarily have a very technical background, but are familiar with VPNs. I'm going to encourage you just for a moment, listen to what Noelle said, and you can also hear this session on demand. Just think about how you may use your traditional VPN today. You've got to be logged onto your desktop. You got to be connected. You've got to then connect to the VPN. It's that device on which the client is installed, and only that device will allow you to access the network servers or to access the shared drives in your corporation. But you and I know very well, suddenly, in my case, the cats decide they want to throw a tantrum and I need to go and feed them. And suddenly I'm working off my phone, or I got to separate the cats because they've gotten into an argument. Those can get very messy. And then I have to work on my phone or my iPad. And suddenly I don't have the client there. It does disrupt the workflow. I also want you to start thinking a little bit about how much memory or how much consumption does the VPN have on your system, where suddenly it starts to slow down your overall performance. Zero trust, or at least the framework of zero trust, tries to enable a more seamless model around that. And I think, Noelle, you've pointed this out very, very clearly. Now, there's a couple of questions that have come in, and I think it's fair for us to take them. Now, Noelle, when it comes to zero trust network architecture, one of the questions that's come in here is, look, and I can tell this from experience, I have many clients who work with me in applied research who probably have one person who's doing IT, who's doing their website, and also doing the marketing for them, and also maintaining their CRM. But that person understands how to deploy, let's say, Cloudflare for CDN and caching, for example. Is the same possible with zero trust network access? Is it that simple? Is it a plug and play like model? Or is it something that is securely meant for enterprise and not the smaller organizations with one or two, or let's say 5 people working in them? Noelle?
That is a great question. And I guess sort of speaking to my desire to help people, these are sort of my favorite stories and my favorite places to help organizations, because, like I identify with that, like, how do we get started? How do we do this? I want to solve the problem. And so we've gotten a number of customers who have come to us with the exact story of, it's hard for us to get started. We know we need better security. We don't have the resources or the budget. And that's one of our favorite places to help. And so I guess my best story that I have related to this is we had a customer who was a startup and said this exact thing. We want to get started. How do we do it? We don't have the budget. We have a small team. And so the first place that we could really help them was remote access, because, they wanted to use a VPN to access, all of their resources. But at the same time, they were really SaaS driven. And, what was the best way for them to try and force everyone through this VPN? But then they were using SaaS and performance wasn't good, and they were struggling. So we sort of recommended moving to our Access product and the way that Access works. And again, I'm not the product manager for it. I'm not the most knowledgeable about all of the intricacies, but the way our Access product works is it integrates with your SSO, and it can check your device posture so that we can verify the identity without having to force you through the VPN and backhaul all that traffic. So the number one way we see these small teams get started immediately is they use Access instead. They set it up really quickly, and it immediately gets them to verify who these people are accessing their SaaS tools without having to use a VPN. And we've seen so many companies and so many stories come to us and say, like, this is wonderful. Like, I started with just one application and setting that up with with access, and now all of our applications are set up through it because it's so much easier for us. The creation of the rules are easy, and it provides the security provisioning where we can say like, okay, these contractors or these sets of employees can access these applications, and these contractors and these other employees can access these other applications, and provisioning that is easy and simple. So that's sort of one of our favorite things that we get to talk about and help customers with. And then I would say that's one of the favorite places that we've seen customers get started. And then as they grow and they get resources and they start to explore more into zero trust, then they can look into secure web gateways and the rest of the product line. And so, I think that's a great story, and I love helping customers in that way.
Yeah, and I think this whole concept of, we have a lot of buzzwords and buzz lines in the industry. We talk about this concept of we got to move beyond the perimeter, and we got to move beyond the trust but verify like models. But I have to admit, for the audience, this is where Cloudflare really comes in, is that you can take those, and I don't mean this to sound rude to anyone, but you can take those baby steps first. In this case, just dealing with access to, let's say, a set of applications, and then graduating into the secure web gateway, so on and so forth. Truth be told, this does require some budget. It does become a line item. It's not things that you can just deploy and expect support on without any budget items to it. It is there. It is a reality. But like I said before, once upon a time, it was a convenience. Now it tends to be a necessity. There's a question that I got direct messaged to me, and I'll reword it just a little bit, because clearly this individual has gone to the file that Jillian posted on the Cyber Exchange group, which talks about zero trust network access from Cloudflare. And the question asks is, in your whole model of zero trust access, you've also got identity access providers in there. You've got the Oktas of the world, etc., and that provide these kind of authentication mechanisms. How does that all work together? Are you working with different providers and giving us a set of solutions? Can you walk our audience a little bit through that?
So at a high level, the way that it works is that we work with those identity providers, and on our platform, you can set up your identity provider that you already have set up as a customer, and you create rules around the identity provider you already have integrated. And then you can also add in other rule sets along the way. So you can say, I want this to be verified through our identity provider. And then I also want to add a device posture check for, say, something like an EDR tool, something like that. So really the way that it works is that we're just checking for the information that's associated with, the identity provider, as well as other criteria that, the customer is up to decide. So that's really the heart of it, I would say.
Thank you for that. Now, I definitely expected a couple of these questions to come in, and I'm not sure which one to take first, but I'll flip my imaginary coin and we'll go with the question on pricing first. Now, I've always believed that people know the price of everything and the value of nothing, but this doesn't apply to this group. Everybody seems to be embracing the value of what Noelle is talking about. A direct question from Taylor. He asks, or she asks, how are ZTN or Zero Trust Network Services priced out? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so we really try to make it flexible for the customer. So I don't want to specifically say for exactly this service, it's exactly this price, because the customer themselves might try to package things a little bit differently. So I can't really provide direct numbers because it will vary. But ultimately, like the way that we try and offer it is to make it very price friendly and to make it flexible based on what the customer wants, whether it just be access or gateway or browser isolation, and soon to be CASB, and then eventually DLP. But so we have some pricing information on our website, and I know that we would love to have people start conversations with our team about what works for them, what pricing needs they have. So I won't give a specific answer on that one, but I have faith that the numbers are friendly.
And you know what, I'll take that a step forward and provide some more friendly advice, is that if you're looking to get started, I know we've got some folks on the enterprise that are listening as well, and I've got a couple of your questions in place. I see Mark from Waterloo Hydro there as well, so I'll definitely be asking your question, but I'll also add this point, is that when you want to get started in Zero Trust and you want to adopt this framework, one of the best starting points, especially if you are a small business, is to have an inventory of your digital ecosystem. Know what tools you're using, know what applications are critical to your day-to-day usage, and have that inventory. I cannot tell you how many times I've gone into meetings where we're trying to do a quick assessment and nobody knows, for example, whether we use OneDrive or we use Dropbox. These are those kind of things that you want to start off with and then begin your journey. And I think that's where you'll begin to see maximum return on investment when you take this approach, so-called zero, which is called zero trust. Noelle, I was expecting this question, and since we had spoken a little bit about insider threat, and the fact that even I mentioned that, we need to move beyond, you mentioned castle moat, I mentioned we need to move beyond the trust but verify kind of equations. We're now in this situation where two interesting questions have come out. And one is, can our zero trust architecture ever fail? Or for lack of a better word, you've heard of the line, there's always a bug somewhere. But is there anything in zero trust that can actually result in it not operating the way you intended it to operate?
I think that because of the very large definition of zero trust and security as a whole in terms of how it operates, right? All security operates on the concept of defense in depth, and there is no one single silver bullet that can solve every security problem. I think that the high level concept of verifying request identity and being able to track and gain visibility on request identity is sort of never a bad thing. And you always sort of want to move towards being able to verify that identity, make sure that it's not just the outer perimeter that requires a lock and key, but the internal perimeters require a lock and key and maybe a bouncer too, because you really want to protect those individual services. So I realize that it's sort of a vague answer because at the end of the day, like I can't answer for every possible zero trust architecture, and I can't answer for exactly how anyone is going to set that up and whether or not that can or can't fail. But I think that you should always think of security in terms of defense in depth and risk tolerance and the use cases that you need for your specific application. And how you're going to design that to best, maximize both security and usability. So it's a tough answer because it's a large answer. How do you speak for everything?
Absolutely, and I've always retained or maintained rather this position that different roads can lead to the castle, and there could be many different ways in which you could breach a zero trust environment as well. One of the things that I will add to this is that when you do partner with a vendor, whether it's Cloudflare or whoever you choose, pay attention to what levels of support, what levels of service sustainability that they have. Those SLAs are extremely important. And I think that for those of us who are Cloudflare users, one of the things that drives us a lot is their presence, their points of presence globally. And that ensures the service reliability, the service reliance that many of us are looking for. And also the relationship that you build with the account managers, with the product managers, and with the team in general, all speaks to how you can consistently not just deploy, but also monitor your zero trust architecture and your zero trust frameworks. Speaking of monitoring, there is an interesting question which, Noelle, I don't know if we can answer, but feel free to say, Ali, this is a subject for another day or another planet. Brittany asks, does zero trust also mean that employers can track employees?
I mean, like that question kind of like ties into cybersecurity as a whole, right? All of cybersecurity requires some measures of visibility and logging, and how an individual employer uses that visibility and logging is the subject, is the decision of that individual employer. But I wouldn't think of it any more or less than any other cybersecurity implementation. At that point, it's just how do we secure our network, how do we gain the visibility we need to protect it.
Yeah. I will add to this is I know that since I'm on the board for Canadian Women in Cybersecurity, one of the topics we were considering, although I don't think we are proceeding with it, we may do another session on it. It was titled actually by Kat Cooch. She's a senior privacy expert here in Ontario, and she titled the session Bossware, which is actually talking about monitoring from employers, but there was looking at it more from a policy perspective, and that's how much they're actually telling you about what's being monitored and what's not. So I do believe, and Brittany, not to sort of downplay the question, very relevant question, but as Noelle said, is that at the end of the day, from a security perspective, you do need some audit trails, you do need some log trails. But of course, how much of that is being gathered, how much of it is being used, how is it being analyzed, is it influencing performance, pay decisions, etc. That is a separate question, which if you also go on Cyber Exchange, I did a power hour with a couple of folks in the privacy space. The names defeat me, but I'll drop them in the live chat. But we did talk a little bit about performance measuring and tracking. Great question. Keep them coming. I see two more questions, which we're going to take a little later on. So thank you for putting them in there. And Noelle, I just want to graduate the conversation a little bit more since we have about 11 minutes left. Time flies when you are having fun. Noelle, when it comes to zero trust architecture, and how do you measure that it's actually doing what you want it to do? What are some metrics or what are some dashboards that you can look at to determine whether your framework and whether your desired solution is achieving what you intended for it to achieve?
That's a fantastic question. And I think it will vary kind of depending on the tool set that you have. But some of the fascinating ones that I've seen is, can you gain visibility into, what services your employees are using? Are they services they're supposed to be using? Are they services that you had no idea, right? Shadow IT. We've had a ton of customers get on calls and say, we learned that our employees are using Miro a lot, and like we didn't know that they were using that. So like just learning, what your employees are using and how they have it set up is a fantastic place to start, because I think that goes back to your identity and access. That goes back to where your data is. So that's a great metric that I've seen. And then sort of, I guess, the next piece of it that I've also seen on the CASB side is, like what are the postures of those setups. And like, if you were to look at, say, your Google instance or your Microsoft instance, like how are you configured? Is your data exposed? Is your data, secured properly? And being able to scan and see that you have all of the security measures in place that you want to have. So those are sort of two that I've seen customers love and use, because it starts to give them visibility. And I think that one of the main threads that I've heard from so many different conversations, even sort of prior to Cloudflare and now with Cloudflare, is, we just got started, we're launching, we're a small, scrappy team, and we don't have visibility, and we're trying to figure out how to get that. And sort of starting with the application use and the application configuration can sort of be a great place to learn, okay, the next step of how do we plug the holes? Once you have the visibility, you can move more towards the protection.
Yeah. And I've always, sometimes I do scare some of my students, especially when I talk about, when you have to deploy a solution from scratch. I always use the metaphor that if you truly want to make apple pie from scratch, you truly need to create the universe first. But I'm being facetious when I say that, is that there are templates and some boilerplates that you can start using to begin your work with. Noelle, let me ask you this question, that if people are looking for some resources or some case studies on zero trust development, where are there anything that they can find on your website, any resources that you would recommend for them to take a look at?
Yeah, we definitely do have stories on our website. We have a number of just partners that we worked with and moved into zero trust, and how did they get started. We have a number listed on there, which are really fun and interesting. And then I think our team would love to have conversations about, like things that they've seen and how can we help customers, and, what the products can do and the stories that we can sort of help with. I love listening in on those calls. Those are really fun, because we have those customers come in and say, we don't know what to do. Can you show us? And, by the end, they feel like they have a place to start. But I highly recommend starting with our website. We have stories on there. I believe one of my favorites that I read recently was Science Museum in Minnesota, which, again, science nerd, the whole thing that I am. So I loved that story right there. So yeah, I would definitely recommend reading there, feeling like you get comfortable with the story and the product line, thinking of a place to start.
I think an interesting observation that I just made also is that, this is an introduction to, what your journey, of course, and now you embracing zero trust and being an ambassador for this model as well. I mean, for some, it can be an inherently very difficult word to absorb. I've been in meetings where, HR folks are zero trust, and suddenly it means that, you trust nobody and everybody's suspect. And I think there's a bit of an education that needs to happen. Folks need to realize this is a framework, and what folks like Cloudflare can do is give you the tools, but also give you the steps that you need to take to follow that framework. A question that I have, Noelle, is, you've been in both the public sector and even the private sector. Perhaps this is a little bit of a tough one, but I'm going to ask it nonetheless. Do you find it's easier to deploy such models within the private sector and less so in the public sector, especially when you're dealing with front end, client facing, citizen facing applications? Any perspective on that, Noelle?
Yeah, I definitely found a little bit more sort of flexibility and ability to move faster in the private sector personally. Especially when I was teaching, right? That was a place where there was no budget and there was, like one IT guy who had to support everything. That was a place where trying to get anything set up was slow going and difficult. My smart board when I was a teacher was not exactly very smart because it would like just take a figure all the time. Like I absolutely, have seen a little bit more agility in the private sector. But that gives me a soft spot for the public sector because I've been there. I understand the challenges and, I want them to succeed just as much.
I think this is where I want to make a critical point is, and again, shout out to the crew at CyberX, Cloudflare as well for supporting the upcoming conference. You'll meet folks from the province of Ontario, their Center for Cybersecurity Excellence. And one of the key things that they've been impressing upon us is educating the public, educating the citizens on all of these practices around security. It is no longer valid for someone to say they don't understand the basics in security, and we need to be doing a better job in making the public aware. I think those days are far gone where you can say, oh, I'm not technical. We're all using some form of digital technology. And the analogy that one individual used was really good, was that, if you are in that position where you need to have a home monitoring system, you don't pretend like you don't understand how the monitoring system works. You start to think through every potential loophole in your house. Take the same mentality towards your digital ecosystem, and you'll slowly start to peel away. And what do we mean by trust and zero trust, so on and so forth? And I see that it's been dropped in the chat. I recommend to everyone, if you have the opportunity, please go through some of those resources. They're extremely useful. And if you want to ask more questions, you can reach out to the team at Cloudflare or meet them at Canadian Women in Cybersecurity. Noelle, the clock's ticking. We have about 5 minutes till we come to a soft landing. Noelle, one more question, and then we'll wrap up for this afternoon. Noelle, this has to do with when you think about zero trust and you look at the adoption. Now, I read on your site that one of the stats said that, in 2020, and feels hard to even imagine that I'm saying 2022, we're halfway through 2022. But in 2020, your stats suggested that there's about a 5% adoption of zero trust network architecture. By 2022, you're seeing a 45% adoption for zero trust network architecture. Your crystal ball on where do you see this going, and what are the main driving forces behind this adoption?
That's a fantastic question, and I will say that I probably sound a bit like a broken record, but just from listening to customers and listening on customer calls and hearing their problems, like it is continuously that companies are in the situation of having, remote employees, remote contractors. They want to give access to something, but they don't want to give access to everything. The VPN gives access to too much. And they don't know how to provision it, and they're nervous about that. And how do we find a way to give access to a certain set of users and still maintain our security posture? Because I keep hearing that story, I really do think that it's kind of the driver that of that growth, and I think it will continue to grow because I think so many companies, they all of a sudden had to go remote overnight. And they found an answer. It wasn't the best answer, but it was an answer, and it kept them up and running. And they put a patch over the hole, and it's been running and ever since. And sort of finally, they're getting the opportunity to move out of it and look, how do we improve things? How do we get better? So I expect to continue to see that trend continue because more and more companies are looking for how do we solve this long term? How do we reduce user friction and give a better user experience, as well as improve our security posture. So yeah, absolutely. I hope to see it grow.
Yeah, and I think, I second that school of thought as well, primarily because and I don't think I saw any question about this, but it was probably just playing up in my mind, is that, zero trust architecture doesn't start or stop anywhere per se. It can be applied to, for example, how you authenticate users to use your Wi-Fi systems, let's say at a hotel. It can be used to, for example, how you allow students to look at their grades. One of the things that we deal with quite a bit, and it's not specific to an institution, but as academics, we find ourselves consistently looking at cases for plagiarism or cases where students may try to access or change a grade or whatever have you. Things like this do happen. So there really is almost every area which has a digital footprint where the zero trust framework can apply. And it gives you that extra sense of security, but more than anything, it really gives you contextual based security, which is extremely, extremely important. Now, I know we've come to the closing 2 minutes of our session, but before I thank Noelle, I do want to thank the audience. There have been some fantastic questions. Shout out to Holly, Raj, Mark for all of your questions on the platform. Truly appreciate it. And I see Holly said that she's got her ticket to come to Canadian Women in Cybersecurity. Please drop by the Cloudflare booth. I will be on a couple of sessions. So, just cheer from the crowd and say, I saw that person on Cyber Exchange. And I'll be more than happy to give you a shout out at the session as well. To the folks that are watching as well, when we heard about Noelle's career, one of the things that you're going to experience at CWC along with Cloudflare is opportunities also for mentorship and recruitment. There'll be a career village, an opportunity to get your headshot done. And I'm sure Noelle can tell you a thing or two about when she was applying online, what that journey was like and how the journey is continuous. So with that, I'm going to come to my final question to Noelle. And I know I did not put this in our script, but it wouldn't be me if it was entirely on script. And Noelle, a book or a person who has influenced you in all of the successes that you've achieved? Anything or anybody that comes to mind?
That's such a big question for my whole career. I don't really think I have one particular answer. I think that, there would be like a cheesy answer of like I had so many like wonderful people one-on-one that helped me shape who I am and helped me get here. But I'll give a nerdy answer because it's newer for me and it's like helping challenge me grow, and it is so nerdy. But I'm a huge like sci-fi and fantasy reader, and I started reading Wizard of Earthsea and started getting into Ursula Le Guin's stories, and now I'm moving into The Left Hand of Darkness, and I just love the ability to think outside the box a bit and challenge my brain a bit. So I think that looking for sort of more female authors and looking for ways to read things and expand my mind a little bit is exciting for me.
As a friend of mine once said, let's not just think outside of the box, let's burn the box completely. Noelle, what a mic drop moment on which to end this session. Noelle, an absolute pleasure. I've only met you once before, that too online, but it has truly been a session where I've got to learn a little bit about your journey. We've given the audience some tips, and more importantly, we've started on the first step of a journey of framing what do we mean by zero trust network access and data loss prevention strategies. I think you stayed very true to the topic of empathy and zero trust and helping organizations with where to get started and giving them the first steps in a secure posture, which really Cloudflare has done for numerous enterprise and numerous small businesses that I know of personally. So Noelle, thank you so much. I'm going to ask you to stay on so that when I bid the audience adieu, we can just have a quick 2 minute in the green room and then we can part ways. To our audience, thank you again for joining us. As I mentioned, there are a couple of more sessions happening on Cyber Exchange. There's a show called Cyber Journeys. There's Beyond the Perimeter. There's shows with Toronto School of Management. There's shows with Human, a whole bunch of shows. And then 21 days later, we'll all be in this blasphemous thing called online and in person at Canadian Women in Cybersecurity in the beautiful city of Vaughan. And I'll be there for both the days. And I'm looking forward to seeing you all there. I see that the link, if you haven't got your tickets, is already listed down there. And you can reach out to the CyberX team for any more support that you may need. Two things that I really learned from this session today, that it's not about uniformity, it's about unity. Unity will drive us forward from a diversity perspective. Unity and diversity will allow us to see the different skills that people have. I've said this before, diversity is not just about ethnicity and race, it's about diversity of skill, thought, and ability. Neurodiversity is a very good example of that. And you saw pieces of that in Noelle's conversation around her work in physics and how that translated into now a very successful career and a growing career in cybersecurity. The second thing that I will add And I shared this on a post that I did on LinkedIn regarding the upcoming conference, where I said, and I quoted the Aga Khan, and he said that, greater connectivity does not mean greater connections. You need to make that effort to get to know the client, get to know the customers, listen to understand rather than listen to reply. And I think Noelle has held the Cloudflare flag very strongly in this session, where she's listening to understand what her clients and future clients are facing and expecting of her. With that, I thank you all for joining. Stay safe, stay healthy wherever you are, and I'll see you either at my next online session or at Canadian Women in Cybersecurity or at 8:15 p.m. at my local restaurant breaking my fast, because boy, oh boy, has it been a long fast. Take care. This is Ali Hirji signing out.